All right, we have a full slate on this, so let's go. Non-renewable resources. Remember, what that means is this. Once they're used, they're gone forever, or nearly so. In other words, they're going to regenerate over very long periods of time, or they need to be recycled or reused. There's two fundamental types of non-renewable resources. Those that are energy-based, in other words, we as human beings use them to generate energy, or minerals. Let's take a look at energy usage through time on the planet. This begins in 1820 and ends at 2010, but you get the idea here. So notice in 1820, right around in this area, notice what's going on. That it's mostly biofuels, overwhelmingly wood. That was the way we generated energy. But then notice around 1820, because of the Industrial Revolution spreading around the planet, which begins in England in the 1750s, coal begins to be used. And by around 1900 or so, coal begins to overtake biofuels in terms of generating energy. And you can see that biofuels, which again is mostly wood, begins to go down and decline. Coal begins to become more important. But then oil, about 1900, begins to become much more important. The reason is this. In the late 1800s, the British began to shift their navy from a coal-based energy generating navy to an oil-based energy propelling their ships along. And so oil exploration began in earnest around the planet, and especially the richer countries began to use it much more. And of course, by the 1960s, automobiles began to be in everybody's lives, and so oil is used all over the place at that point. Natural gas, which was burned off, becomes important around the same time that oil becomes important, becomes really important by the 1960s. Notice hydroelectric power. Now, we've been building dams forever, basically, on the planet, but hydroelectric power begins to become more important during the 1960s. And then, of course, we understand the way the atom works and uranium and plutonium and all that. And so nuclear power becomes more important beginning in the 1960s. Okay, now look here. This is American usage of energy through time. Very similar. Notice at the time of the Revolution, 1776, we're using overwhelmingly biofuels, wood. Then we begin to utilize coal as the country begins to industrialize prior to the Civil War, especially in the North. And you can see that also petroleum begins to be used about the late 1800s, beginning in the first part of the 20th century. And of course, then cars come on and we use it like crazy. Natural gas, which is overwhelmingly used to generate heat in the United States and, provide energy for stoves and generate electricity. And then you can see that coal begins to kind of like taper off a little bit beginning in the 1980s and is continuing downwards. But of course, we are substituting nuclear power beginning in the 1950s because we know how to use it. And then other renewables, hydroelectric. There you go. This is the pattern that we have had in this country. I'm going to want you to recognize the patterns. Like, for example, I might ask you a question on the exam. At the time of the Revolution in the United States, what was the primary source of energy? Well, that would be wood or biofuels. Same thing with the previous slide that has to do with the planet itself. So fossil fuels, this is a really important term here. What it means is what it sounds like it means. These were things that were once alive that over very long periods of time, generally millions of years, have been converted into some other thing that then we as human beings are able to use. Whether this was plants or animals, whatever it was, it is converted over very long periods of time through heat and pressure into something else. 3 fossil fuels produce more than 3/4 of the world's energy. And those 3 fossil fuels you can see in those pictures right there. Left, center, and right. Coal, oil, and natural gas. Take a look at this pie chart here. It's primary global energy consumption in 2019. And notice, oil accounts for about 33% of the energy consumption on the planet, natural gas about 24%, coal about 27%, and then the rest is made up of nuclear energy, which is a small percentage, 4%, hydroelectric about 6%, and then various forms of renewable energy. So these are a couple of these pie diagrams that come from the University of Michigan that I'm using. On the left-hand side, you can see energy consumption by sector. So in other words, how are we using this energy? What are we using it for? Industry, 32%. Transportation, moving from one place to another, 28%. Residential, 21%. Commercial, about 18%. And notice with regard to transportation, how do we move ourselves from point A to point B? Well, in the United States, what do? I mean, mostly 76.4%, we drive alone, right? We're in a car and we're just moving along alone. And then you can see, of course, over here, carpool, 9.1%. Is that the way you move? Public transport, is that the way you move around? Southern California is difficult. If you live in New York, it's easier. But if you live in Southern California, this is a very difficult way to do that, to move from point A to point B. Now, U.S. energy consumption by source, notice what we're doing. Coal, petroleum, which is oil, and natural gas. It's overwhelmingly the way we generate energy in the United States, with a little bit of nuclear and renewables. Let's compare the U.S. to global. Well, we're not much different. 80% in the United States of our energy is produced with fossil fuels, and globally it's about 84%. All right, now fossil fuel consumption. This is in 2019. The darker the orange color, the more of fossil fuel consumption per country. Notice that China is at the top of this, all right? Then here we are, the United States, just lagging right behind them with the Russians, India, all right? You can see Germany, for Europe, kind of a lot, all right? Good. Now, share of electricity production from fossil fuels. This is one of the main things we do. I mean, are you really willing to give up your phone or your computer or your television or whatever, electrical lights? Are you willing to give these things up? Well, if we're going to have electricity, we have to generate it. And one of the main ways we do this globally is through using fossil fuels, burning fossil fuels, and then turning turbines and generating electricity. Now notice, we're not at the top of the list. Here we are, the United States. Once again, the darker that sort of brownish color, the more of your electricity is generated from fossil fuels. And interestingly enough, North Africa, South Africa, then Central Asia, these are the places that are using it the most. Fossil fuel consumption per capita. Do you know what per capita means? It means per person in the country. Okay, so how much is each person in the country using? Well, notice that in the United States, North America, which includes Canada, we're using a lot. And we compare that to the world, that means each individual person in North America is consuming more fossil fuels than the average on the planet, and certainly much more than Africa, which is the poorest part of the planet. So fossil fuel consumption per capita with these 6 countries. Why did I choose these 6 countries? Because these are the 6 largest countries in population in the world. China's number 1 with 1.4 billion. India's number 2 with 1.3 billion. The United States is number 3 with about 335 million. Indonesia is 4th with 270 million. Pakistan has about 217 million. And then Brazil has about 211 million. But notice that for the top 6 countries of population, we are per capita per person using the most energy that's generated by fossil fuels, okay? Most fossil fuel consumption. However, does this make you feel better? Qatar, also known as Qatar, the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Oman, all these countries around the Persian Gulf, they are per capita using more than we are. Now, their populations are small, and what do they have? They have oil. This is what they have, and natural gas. So that's the way they generate energy, is by using fossil fuels, because that's their option, really. But Qatar has 2.8 million people. The UAE has 9.7 million people. Kuwait has 4.2 million. Saudi Arabia has 34 million, and Oman only has 5 million people in it. So we're talking about the populations of California and New York combined, basically. Nevertheless, per person, they are using more. And in fact, if you want to really suss this out, they also generate more air pollution per person than we do in the United States, or than the Chinese. Now, of course, Chinese in the United States have much bigger populations. Nevertheless, per person, the Gulf states produce a lot of pollution. So annual change in fossil fuel consumption. As you go towards the brown, you're increasing fossil fuel consumption. And as you go towards the darker green, you're decreasing. And notice we are doing pretty good in this. So over a 2-year period, we were decreasing our fossil fuel consumption. Now, this is partly because there are better fuel standards with our automobiles, and people are buying those automobiles. This is also because we are kind of naturally decreasing our usage and increasing the usage of renewable resources, Whereas other places in the world, you can see China, India, Iran, the Aussies, they're all increasing over that period of time their consumption of fossil fuels. Annual change in oil consumption. Once again, as you go towards purple, you are increasing. As you go towards green, you are decreasing. Now, part of what's happening with us also is that GM is kind of leading the way in saying that by 2035, they will no longer be producing automobiles that are motivated to move from one place to another with fossil fuels, with oil. So we are beginning to make a move away from this. Notice these are the top 5 countries in terms of proven reserves of oil, petroleum. Saudi Arabia has remained relatively steady since 1990. Notice that Venezuela has gone up very rapidly. The Canadians have gone up very rapidly. Now with Canada, what's happened is that they have begun to exploit the oil sands, which is a kind of difficult way to extract oil. It's a very polluting way to extract oil out of these oil sands in Alberta, but nevertheless, they are doing it because the price of oil began to make it profitable during the early 2000s, and now they've continued that. So where are the proven reserves of oil? Take a look there. You can see here's Venezuela, here's the Saudis, Iran, Iraq, Canada. We have some. The Russians have more. Libya has more. Notice where there's not a lot of it. There's not a lot of it in Europe. So crude oil, what does that mean? Crude oil is the black goop that comes out of the ground. It's unrefined. That's the way it's generally referred to as crude oil. And crude oil is exchanged on the open market in what's known as a barrel of oil. A barrel has 42 gallons of oil. This comes about because when John D. Rockefeller originally started the oil industry in the United States, mostly in western Pennsylvania, they just had these big barrels that had 42 gallons, and that's what they put it in. And so that's the way it's traded, as a barrel of oil with 42 gallons of oil in it. Proven reserves means they know it's in the ground. They're certain it's there. In 2019, there were 1.72 trillion barrels of oil that were proven reserves. At our current rate of consumption, that would mean 50 years remaining. But in 1998, there were 1.14 trillion barrels. How is that possible that were proven? What happened? Well, there's also something known as potential reserves, which means they believe there's oil in the ground, and they're constantly finding more. So if I was to be completely honest with you, we probably really have 75 to 100 years of oil at our current rates of consumption. OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Its headquarters is in Vienna, Austria, even though Austria has no oil. And there are 13 countries currently in OPEC. This changes from time to time. But here's the countries: Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, which is United Arab Emirates, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Congo, Nigeria, Algeria, and Libya. Those countries combined have about 79% of the proven reserves of oil. And the goal of OPEC is simple. It's really just to make money off of oil. So what do you get out of these 42 gallons of crude oil? Well, if you take a look at that, basically it comes down to this. About 45% is gasoline, 25% is other versions of fuel, 9% is jet fuel and kerosene. There's some other things they make out of it, like about 70% is plastics, paints, solvents, detergents, synthetic rubber, propane, asphalt, tires, wax, lipstick. Now, there are other plant-based energy sources. We call this biomass or biofuels. Wood, plants, animal waste, which is what you see in that picture, that's animal dung from cows that gets burned. These are used for heating, cooking, and even removal of waste. Then there's mineral resources. Mineral resources come in 2 types: pretty things and useful things. That's right. Pretty things are mostly gemstones. They look nice, but what do? Pretty much nothing. Gold, silver, sure, gold conducts electricity, but mostly we just turn it into jewelry and gold ingots. And then the useful things are like iron ore, copper, aluminum, lead, magnesium, zinc, chromium, cobalt, manganese, nickel, tin, titanium, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, sulfur. Take a look at this map. This is a spread of the mineral resources around the planet. Notice that they're pretty well spread around, and from time to time, what's important changes. What we use in our phone and in our computers, these rare earth things, these used to just end up in slag heaps, but now we utilize them.